Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I am Leslie Van Sant, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. Thank you so much for joining us at the Diane Rehm Book Club today. At WAMU, we strive to connect our listeners and members to the world throughout thought-provoking programming. We hope our conversations encourage exploration and celebration of diverse stories and people and perspectives. Some housekeeping for today's edition of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Please use the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen to interact with each other and our book club producer, Allison Brody. Also, today's event will be closed captioned. Just click the CC button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to access this. This afternoon promises to be such a treat. I hope you enjoyed The Covenant of Water as much as I did. This book club is made possible through the generosity of WAMU members and listeners like you. If you enjoy today's event, please consider making a gift and support. You can donate at dianerehm.org/give. And now, without further pause, it is my great pleasure to introduce our host, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Leslie, for those words. And welcome to the August meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. This month, our selection is The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. Released in May, the novel tells the story of 3 generations of a family in Kerala, India. And there is so much to talk about. Joining me, Maaza Mengiste. She's author of The Shadow King and Beneath the Lion's Gaze. Daniel Marchalik, Associate Professor of Medicine and founding director of the Literature and Medicine track at Georgetown University's School of Medicine, and Preetha Mani. She is Associate Professor of South Asian Literatures at Rutgers University. She joins us from India. And there is a question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to pose a question to our guests, please feel free to put them there, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. Welcome to all of you. I'm so pleased to see you. I must say the title of this book, The Covenant of Water. Covenant has two meanings, both biblical and literary and legal indeed. And I wonder, Preetha, how you read that title.
Yeah, I was thinking about this a lot today, actually, because the novel returns to it over and over. And as you get to the end, you have a much, you kind of end with this thought about covenant as some of the characters are passing away, like when big Amachi passes away, she thinks about the covenant she has with water. And so often the book, repeatedly in the novel, we get this discussion of covenant with water, but the question for me was, what is this covenant? What's the contract? Who is it between? And it didn't seem to me that it's always exactly, it is a covenant of faith, but it's not necessarily one with God. It seems to be one between the land and the water, and the people on the land who must sort of give themselves or sacrifice themselves to the water in order to maintain the relationship between the land and the water. So I was thinking especially of that scene when Philipose goes with the baby, the boatman's baby, and despite knowing that the water is dangerous for him, at this young age, he takes the baby in the flood and he rushes, to this in the storm to save this child's life, and he kind of has to cross the water that threatens his life to make a connection with someone, Digby, who ends up becoming, and then he meets Elsie. So it becomes this sort of way of connecting with people at the same time that this very water and the very instinct to save a child despite the water is what kills him in the end of his life too.
And indeed, that is the curse, if you will, Daniel, that is on this family, this covenant, be it with God or be it with water, that does take the lives of one person in each generation. Did you, as a surgeon and just rushing onto the scene with us from surgery, think medically when you read that title, or did you, as you got into the book, realize that something was medically wrong here?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so much to react to right now, but I think reading it, I did not know what to expect with it being the covenant of water, but it felt as though the emphasis in the title on nature, on the land, on the water, seemed like you knew what you were in for, and the directions were almost in the title, and certainly something that features prominently in other similar literature and God of Small Things, the idea that the relationship with the land is a precarious one. But it's interesting because there's a line where Philipose is talking about Japan and he says, you try to elude fate, but the hound finds you anyway. I think that's the relationship with the land and with the water, which is it will decide when it wants you and when it's your time. So, just like Preetha said, like, you can take the river in its most aggressive form and be fine, or you could be crossing on a bridge on a train and it'll take you anyway. And it's almost like it can drown you when you're swinging off a tree, or it can also give you a baptismal rebirth like it did with Elsie, where she goes down river and reemerges with a new life. Like it's ablution, it is a recreation. So it's interesting because at the end of the day, these characters are at the mercy of the water. I think that is their pact, that is their covenant with the land. That is, the land will give you as much as it will give you, and you have to accept it because ultimately it will decide.
Maaza, your thoughts?
I've so enjoyed hearing what Preetha and Daniel have to say, but one of the things I think we can think of covenant also in terms of the thread of faith that runs through here with Big Amachi. I mean, it was really present. And the sense that Big Amachi believed in something much bigger than herself, and in a sense where some people might believe in the curse or fate or destiny, she had this sense that she was guided by her belief by God. There was a covenant between him and her family, and yet I think that felt very present. It was probably one of the more obvious interpretations of covenant, but thinking about water and thinking about something, a phrase that Daniel just said with water as baptism, the way that water both energizes and gives a lease or gives allows characters to have new life or destroy it. I thought about fire in that inverse, the complete opposite of water, and the way that is also present here. And the way that fire, it's the only thing that can destroy fire is water. And in this book about water, we have these baptisms by fire, quite literally, also with Digby. And so fire for me felt like a very, very clear, slender thread through here. And I'm thinking now of Lenin at the very, very end, this atheist, young, communist, Marxist rebel. I think that part of the book, that scene at the very end, where we see another kind of a firing on him, was one of the most moving and powerful sections of that book. But I see this idea of water can also extinguish this kind of violence. It can also quench this kind of thirst for human life. And I found that really moving.
Now, let's start at the beginning with the woman who becomes Big Amachi, a 12-year-old who is totally, unbeknownst to her, betrothed to a 40-year-old widow, a widower, with a child, Jojo. Jojo is just 2 when we meet him, a darling child, and our lovely young 12-year-old doesn't have the biggest idea what she's getting into. In fact, her groom, this 40-year-old widower, looks down at her and says, "I'm not going to marry her. She's a child." And he literally leaves the church. And this child is standing there waiting for this man's sister to go and retrieve him and bring him back for the wedding. That was quite a scene. That young child doesn't know what's going to happen, Daniel. And I found myself wondering how often this really does happen in India or in Saudi Arabia or in Syria or other parts of the world. Daniel?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. It's an unbelievably moving theme because it sets up this necessary base for her growth, right? For her to start in such an unbelievably vulnerable place only then to become the matriarch, the caretaker, really the nucleus of so much that happens in the book thereafter. But what I thought was so interesting, it's a long book, right?
Very.
But it's a long book because because you need that amount of familiarity with the family to see the vicissitudes of kind of changes and to understand what evolution looks like. There was a moment where Mariama's talking to her, to Big Amachi.
Mariama being her daughter.
Yeah. And she
And-
she asks her, what did you dream about when you were my age? And she says, me, well, those were the ancient times. I dreamed of having a husband, of having a good family. And she's like, well, what if you were a child now? Like, what if you were 8 years old now? She said, I would dream of being a doctor. And so this evolution of someone who is dreaming of a home so that someone else can dream of being an artist, so that someone else can dream of being a doctor. It's almost that quote by John Adams, right? Like I study politics and war so that my children can study science and mathematics, and they study science and mathematics so their children can study literature and the arts. And that's the sacrifice. Like that is why you have to set her up there at, in church, like basically giving that sacrifice in the very beginning, because it sets the stage for everything else that is possible thereafter.
And we have to say that the reason this 12-year-old is being married off to a 40-year-old widower is because the 12-year-old's father has died. Her
That's right.
uncle has taken over the household. He is not a very nice man, and it is he who insists that this marriage is going to take place, in essence, because he wants to get rid of the child. Preetha, does this still happen in parts of India?
Yes, it of course happens. But the other thing I wanted to add is that it's not just that it's in political discourse or in activist discourses and in and in real legal battles that are happening all the time, but it's also a very prominent literary trope, meaning that this scene of a young child, a child bride being wedded to someone, a widower who, has no other option but to marry a child bride. And, the circumstances are important, that her family is less wealthy, that there isn't any other option really from on her side, and that, he has much to offer in terms of land and wealth and stature, but on the other hand, he also is older, so who is going to marry him? So there's kind of a need on both sides of the family, and this is something that you see very often since the 19th century. In fact, it's a very important literary trope that's been debated in many different ways. And so what's unique to me about this novel is the choice of Abraham Verghese to not name Big Amachi until her granddaughter is born. And that resonates a lot with what you were saying, Daniel, about how she sees, like, if I could choose, and when times change, you can choose. Now that her granddaughter is, has a name, has her name, and she can choose her fate in a way that Big Amachi couldn't, at the beginning of the novel. It's also important, I think, that we actually never really see her as a child. So, but children live through her, and she nurtures them, and she brings them into, she gives so many people life in so many different ways. But she herself, her origin to me felt like a trope that Abraham Verghese wanted to sort of explore and try to fill out. And it took all these generations in some way to fill out this trope, to give that kind of being the life that they might have desired.
Indeed. And Maaza, I'm so glad you're back with us. I was afraid we had lost you for a few moments. I recall that the marriage is not truly consummated though there are tiny bits of a showing of affection on the part of her husband to his young wife as she grows. And it is not until she's 17, as I recall, that they finally consummate the marriage, and then begins a love story between the two of them until the first death in the family has happened again. And that is the death of young Jojo. I'm afraid Maaza is having trouble with her internet, so I hope we can get her back. When Jojo dies, Daniel, I cried. I mean,
Heartbreaking.
heartbreaking. And he
Heartbreaking.
cries, he dies in such a curious way.
Yeah.
He has been told to stay away from the water. He knows that. And so he climbs trees. And then he ends up face down in a ditch.
Yeah. Unbelievably moving, heartbreaking scene, and the desperation, right? This is the first time she's ever left like a child alone because she runs towards Jojo, right? There's so much, yeah, there's so much there. And what I found so interesting, right? He dies in such a curious way. Like you said, he falls off a tree and drowns in a puddle that is a few inches deep. But what I think is so interesting about this idea of the curse is that it's another way that progress is quantified in the book, is that it goes from something incredibly mystical, right? Just across with the squiggly lines representing water on the family tree. Then it becomes a little bit more fleshed out as like you get more information. And then with the amount of progress that allows the granddaughter to go to medical school, you can actually get to the bottom of what it is. And it requires more than just that. It requires Philipose becoming a writer and publishing the Ordinary Man column so that you can get an understanding of like the lineage and the relationships in Kerala. So it's almost like progress gives us an explanatory model for some of the things that we couldn't understand. And some of that is also paralleled in the progress around religion. Like you mentioned that before, Diane, this idea that, Big Amachi is extremely religious, so that you can, and then has a very traditional idea of family, so that then Elsie has a kind of certainly less religious, but also gets to choose her husband, and then gets to choose to leave him. And then you have Mariama, who chooses to have a relationship out of wedlock altogether. So
Yes.
again, more progress, different approach to religion, different approach to science, and different ways of understanding these tragedies like Jojo's death, that goes from, we have no idea what this is a curse, to, oh, there's a scientific explanation here too.
Huh.
So all of these are measures, I think, of moving forward.
Preetha, Philipose meets Elsie when they are both very young. And then he meets her again on a train going from Madras back to home. And he immediately falls in love with Elsie and determines, when he gets home, he says to his mother, I'm going to marry Elsie. And goes to her father. And I found myself thinking, wow, that kind of immediate falling in love can happen, does happen, not only in fairy tales, but it does happen, and it happened mutually. Elsie is for Philipose initially a perfect wife. How did you feel about Elsie?
Well, when I was revisiting some of the parts of the book today, as I was thinking about things, I realized that it doesn't just happen between Philipose and Elsie. I'm sorry, the power just went out, so I hope everything is still working. But it happens between Digby and Elsie as well. When and that also is very early on. She's still a child when she holds his hand and helps him to draw an image of his mother, and it happens between Celeste and Digby. And it in some ways it also happens between Big Amachi and Big Apachen at the very beginning, where when they have that very first firm gaze at each other, and she's kind of unnerved. So I think that is something that we see often throughout the novel. But it also reminded me it's not just about it is about these relationships between the people, but I kept remembering that phrase, geography is destiny, that comes up a couple of times in the novel. And it's like where you are affects your entire future at any given moment. And it has to do both with the entire past of a person, their personal historical, inheritances, but also the inheritances of the entire land that they live in. And it also happens in these I guess, happenstance ways, which is, where you are at a certain moment, that he happened to be there when that child was suffocating, and he happened to take the child and end up at the leprosarium, and then getting in the car. All of these things they seem so coincidental compared to the narrative or the theme of fate that also underlies certain events in the novel. So I thought that was it's wonderful because they sort of exist in tension with each other in certain ways.
And just as Jojo dies, we move to Scotland and meet Digby. And I'm wondering, why are we moving from India to Scotland? It seemed like such an out of step move, and yet he is leading us to the wholeness, the roundness, the circularity of life, and how things happen with seemingly no connection whatsoever, and then creates that connection between Amachi and her husband. And then we meet Digby. Tell us about Digby, Daniel. Digby is a doctor,
a surgeon,
and his first assignment with the Indian Medical Service turns into a total disaster.
It does and it doesn't, right? It turns into a total disaster in that he doesn't have a mentor, and he's kind of it's trial by fire for him, right? And for his patients in a way too. But then he does find a mentor, right? He finds an incredible mentor. In fact, he finds two incredible mentors in his life, which is more than I think most surgeons can say for themselves. It's an incredible fortune. But it's interesting. I mean, reading the descriptions of him, of the way that he's learning to do surgery twice, for the first time as Digby, the fresh graduate in the Indian Health Services, and then again as Digby, who was resurrected after the fire and becomes a leprosy surgeon. And it's really interesting reading this training pathway, because some of it is just so familiar and some of it resonates so much. The fear, the discovery, even the way that Philipose, when he assists in the surgery for the first time, that is actually very reminiscent of being a medical student in the operating room as well. So it's very cool reading these descriptions as having gone through this, and kind of in a way, I mean, there are tons of books about surgery and tons of books about medicine, but this is one of the few that makes me really excited about being a surgeon. Actually, I'm like, wow, I have a cool job. Like this book made me super thrilled.
I can totally understand it, Maaza. I gather you're having a little trouble with your camera, and I'm sorry, but you are back.
I'm back.
And we were just talking about the connection between what's happening in India and the introduction of Digby and his experience in the Indian medical service with a doctor who I can only call a rat. He is a rat from beginning to end. And poor Digby suffers in so many ways because of this doctor. Tell us about him.
Well, this doctor is, I'll say the word cad. I think that's within the in the language of the era. Today we might say asshole. And he is an alcoholic. He is abusive to his wife. He is controlling, demanding, and quite unkind to his staff. He is the kind of doctor you don't want at all. And he doesn't treat his patients very well. And
the patients that he has,
yes, that's
which are only of the upper class and very few patients. He hands off the dregs, as it were, to his new associate.
And he makes a mistake. He makes a fatal mistake that he blames on Digby. I guess we've all read the book. I'm always careful about giving away spoilers, but Digby's relationship with Celeste becomes central to the antagonisms between the two men.
And she is the doctor's wife. The ratty, the awful doctor's wife.
Yes, and I think this part of the book, there was there was a tender moment between Celeste and Digby. The first and only time that they are together, and they make love, they have sex, and it's interrupted by this tragedy that propels Digby in a different direction in his life. And I found that this book was building to a momentum to this huge confrontation between Celeste, her husband, and Digby. And the fire, like most things in this book, it was nature that decided the course of events. It wasn't necessarily the law or humans. It was something else that was beyond their control. And I found that a fascinating aspect of this triangle that was leading up to a really crucial point with the court case.
How did you feel about the court case, Preetha?
I was going to just respond to what Maaza was saying, that it's interesting that, but I also can talk, it's in also to deal with the court case, but it's interesting that Claude Arnold is the only despicable character in the entire novel. There's only one that has no redeemable quality.
And he's a Brit. He's a white Brit.
Yes. And if you read those passages around his character, or when I went back to them, I realized that he represents the worst parts of colonial rule. Whereas there are other characters like Digby and Honorine and even Celeste who have a much more nuanced perspective and who also feel a sense of belonging they have a connection to the land that Claude just doesn't seem to have in the same way. And so I thought, I don't have any answers, or I'm not even sure if I have an interpretation, but I thought it was so interesting that the turn of events did not allow this confrontation, that we hear about the court case after the fact of it happening, and that in fact the climactic event is totally tangential to what one would think of as a classic story of colonialism and resistance to colonial rule. So in that way, it's like, this covenant that he seems to be trying to ask us to actually, all of us as readers, to commit to, it seems to be kind of moving us away from maybe a more conventional relationship between East and West, or our history, our implication in colonial rule, towards a kind of meeting of souls. And Mariam at the end kind of represents that, because she's actually she's an Anglo-Indian, a granddaughter who is kind of the merging of all these worlds in a certain way.
Of course, the novel takes place between 1900 and 1977. We've had 2 world wars. India has finally separated, gained its independence from Britain, but yet there is this looking down upon those India natives that the Brits continue to have. And I think it's the first time I really experienced that in a novel that brought it so much to light. And of course, there is, as you said earlier, Maaza, that fire that not only extinguishes the life of Celeste, but burns Digby's right hand to such an extent that he feels he can never be a surgeon again.
Mhm.
I thought that was horrific, Maaza.
I thought that part was that was a shocking turn of events in a book that felt constantly surprising you with the way that events would go. Digby's hands burned. It gave me pause in the book, because I said, wait a minute, you're not supposed to do that in a novel. You're not supposed to take a surgeon's hands and ruin them when he is one of the main characters. Where do we go from here? And it made me as a reader sit back and think, and this was really one of the points, that fire that killed Celeste and then that burned his hands was a crucial point for me as a reader to begin to understand, wait a minute, this is not a book that is going to go the way that I want it to go. This is a book that is going to go its own path, and it's up to me now to follow it. Willingly or not, I need to follow it and trust the writer, trust that he knows what he's doing with these things, and see where it goes. But that point was a difficult part for me, Diane, and I had to trust. And I'm glad I did. I'm really glad that I opened myself to what I thought the writer was trying to do.
Daniel?
Yeah, well, I actually think that Digby had to have suffered these horrible injuries so that he could be resurrected and reborn, right? And that's true for multiple characters, right? Like there's Digby, and then there's Digby who then, through this adversity, through the trauma, through the loss, ends up rediscovering the new meaning. There's Rune, who ends up having to walk away from his practice only to be reborn. Like he literally goes on a voyage and is reborn after sleeping in a temple for a year, right? Like he's reborn and he realizes this is what I need to do with my life. There's Elsie, who like goes downriver, starts a new life, and then goes blind from leprosy and is reborn as a sculptor, as opposed to being a painter, or so there are a lot of these stories, a lot of this, like almost like there are many Lazaruses in the book. What I was wondering, as we talk about Digby in Scotland, and then Elsie Philipose having to go downriver to meet Digby, and then Elsie helping Digby recover, and then Elsie becomes Philipose's wife. I'm wondering if, for the rest of you, if it worked for you. This idea, it was so unbelievably predestined. Like so much of it is so unlikely that all of these events would have to happen to bring all of these people together that occur at the same time as the rest of the universe in this book is not treated in any kind of special way. Like Philipose brings the boatman's baby downriver through all of this. Like he has an emergency like crike, and the baby is saved only to die 6 months later of a diarrheal disease, right? Like the baby is an afterthought. The baby is a vehicle through which Philipose can have a journey. And I find that really interesting because on one hand, there's no way that that's done accidentally to make these people in the book so special and everybody else an afterthought. Yet on the other hand, what does that say if that's the case?
Preetha? I'm sorry. Go ahead, Maaza.
Just say, Maaza, go first.
I think Preetha and I might have. I mean, I had similar thoughts, Daniel. I had the same questions, which is why the burning of Digby's hands. I said, okay, I could handle a leg, but the hands, all right. But it felt to me like being immersed in a story of a community or in a story of a family, and the way that you sit around a family table and people start telling stories about each other or reminiscing about the past. So many things seem to happen in those retellings. You see the coincidences in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
This happened, and then and then this and this, and then the minor characters kind of drop off. And that's what it felt like. It felt the essence of storytelling, of sitting and listening to Big Amachi telling this story.
Yes.
In hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
And you, Preetha?
Oh, I love that response because it actually puts things in a totally different perspective than what I was thinking when I was, it's not just the ways in which the characters meet each other, but it's also the horrific tragedies that happen at every moment that felt really unbelievable. I was thinking, when Big Amachi finally passes away, I thought, how could one soul experience all of this in their life and retain their solidity in the way that she does throughout this novel?
And her faith.
Truly,
Really,
it's so remarkable. And so that also felt a little bit like, wow, I don't know. So I love this idea that it's about storytelling. And actually at the very beginning of the novel, we hear that Big Amachi says, she's thinking in her mind when Mariama, we get this sort of flash forward where one day her granddaughter will ask her about her life, and she will say, and she won't realize, but then she thinks about the threads of storytelling and what a good storyteller does. So I think you are really touching upon something. When I was reading it, I was just thinking about how there's so much about the novel that's written in the vein of realism, in the sense of like the portraits at the beginning of images, they're not really portraits, at the beginning of each part of the book, they seem to represent something in a kind of realistic fashion, those sketches. And then the language is very straightforward and direct, and you have very precise descriptions of landscape, of the architecture of the home. You have actually encyclopedic descriptions of caste hierarchy, of history, St. Thomas's arrival in Kerala. And so all of those things to me read as, like someone who's trying to tell a story that is supposed to be, that is touches upon the histories that we know and the places that we know. But then on the other hand, you have these very unbelievable things.
Yeah.
And so I love that combination of the two. And I actually didn't know what to do with it.
I was so struck by the intensity of description of the various surgeries. And I wondered how you felt about that, Daniel. I mean, I've never read anything more vivid about a goiter, one that begins in the chest and goes to the chin, and how poor Digby tries to deal with it.
Well, it's interesting. It's everything. It's the descriptions of the surgeries. It's also the description of how Digby takes in Celeste the first time he meets her, right? He like traces her cricoid cartilage down to the path of her internal jugular to the collarbone. Diane, I wonder how you read it, because I read it thinking, I don't know if I think this way as a surgeon, because I don't. Like I see someone and I don't have, and I'm like, does that make me a bad surgeon? Because I don't anatomically dissect people when I'm in front of them. But it made me wonder the purpose of that. Like the
But
purpose
he
of
fell in love.
No, of course. No. And he's an artist.
Yeah.
I meant more the extremely detailed technical language that is that's everywhere in this book and in Cutting for Stone. And I wonder, like, I'm more curious what it feels like for you guys reading this extremely technical medical jargon. If it feels like you're being let into someone else's life in a way that like non-medical language just wouldn't allow you in there, because it's just so precise, or if it's alienating. For me, it felt like a curiosity more than anything. Like I wasn't sure what the purpose of it was.
No, well, speaking for myself, as a former medical reporter in my younger days, I found it absolutely fascinating. And every tissue, every mark, every pulling back so that a scalpel could go in, and I just found it fascinating. I don't know how you felt, Preetha. How did you feel about that surgical description?
I mean, some of it was so graphic that I had to just put the book down, because it's like I felt pain in my own body. But I was thinking, I thought I might just read quickly that. So for me, because I know the Indian landscape somewhat, but I don't know medicine, but I found that there was a way in which he uses the same strategies to describe the landscape that he uses to describe bodies. And so I thought I could just, like, this is very minimal, like very brief, but I'm looking at page 22 if anyone wants to look with me. And there's this part where this is when Big Amachi first comes to the house, and she's just describing, or we're learning about the layout of the Parambo house, this ancestral home. And it says, the house is L-shaped, one limb being the older original house, sitting well off the ground on a high plinth and constructed around the strong room, or ara, in which a family's wealth, money, jewelry, and paddy are stored. A cellar sits below the ara, while an unused bedroom and a large pantry flank it. Next to the pantry is the kitchen. A narrow outer veranda connects everything. The newer limb of the house is lower to the ground with a broad, inviting veranda on three sides. It has a sitting room that gets little use, then two adjacent large bedrooms, her husband's and the one that she, Jojo, and Thangama sleep in, and another room that is used as a storeroom. So we get a very, it's very descriptive. It's very, it's like you're looking at the scene and you're sort of laying it out. It's not, there's no authorial intervention. There's no focalization through character. And then, so then we come to, let's see, page I really just picked these out somewhat quickly at the end. 113. This is when Dr. Ravi Chandran is helping Digby to sort of figure out a surgery, a gastrectomy. Let's see. There's a rock hard mass in the antrum just above the pylorus, I'm sorry about my pronunciation, where the stomach empties, and a location where even a small tumor comes quickly to a patient's attention because they feel full after a few bites. Ravi runs his hand over the surface of the liver, then pulls out the small bowel, all 20 feet of it, feeding it through his hands, looking for a metastasis. Then he inspects the pelvis. No spread, we'll do a distal gastrectomy. Switch sides, I will be your humble servant. Digby cuts out half the stomach. Having Ravi Chandran as a skilled assistant, subtly improving his view and access makes Digby feel like a far better surgeon than he really is. So we get a little bit of Digby's sort of investment in this and his reactions, but there are moments where it's really just about the body and how, you know, like there are parts where he removes the tissue, he peels back this layer, he makes this incision in such and such a way. And I thought, you know, maybe this is because the audience that Abraham Verghese had in mind, he had to sort of train them in something that even the characters he's writing about know really well. I remember there's this one point where Digby is meeting the, I forgot what they're called, the assistants who help him in Longmere Hospital. And he says, Digby knows they're licensed medical practitioners or something. I forgot what the acronym stands for. And that they actually are trained, but we have to learn what that LMP stands for, and he has to explain it to us. And in the same way, he has to do that with the surgeries. He has to do that with the landscape. It's actually I mean, to my mind, it felt like a very ambitious novel for this reason, that he takes on the task of explaining so many things in so many different ways.
I'm going to change the subject here for just a moment. We have a question from Ellen, who says, I hope the panelists will discuss the character of Philipose, his turn toward drugs after the death of his son, and his destruction of Elsie's sculpture, and then his rebirth. Maaza?
I found Philipose to be maybe one of the more complex characters in here because of this journey that he takes. We are rooting for him in the beginning, and then after his marriage to Elsie and the drug addiction, he's not likable at all. I mean, he changes in this book in a way that more so than I think some of the other characters. I found that his addiction was an interesting addition to this book about the frailties of the human body, of the many ways that the body can be injured. In a book about illness and about curse, the addiction became another illness here that's a character had to contend with, and a family, in a sense, had to take care of. And I thought that was a very that was a compassionate rendering of addiction, because it shows both the brutalness of it, the way that it leads the person into other emotionally vulnerable situations, deception and destruction and so on. And yet at the end, there is redemption for Philipose in a way that almost every other character is offered this redemption. But at the end, of course, inevitably, it's the water that kills him. Again, it's that accident. But if I were to look at that water as also symbolic, as covenant, it is for me a kind of baptism, a kind of forgiveness that happens there. So I found Philipose both unlikable initially, but you don't have to like a character if it makes you, if he or she makes you think. And he did make me think about what we do with people in our families who succumb to certain kinds of illnesses or weaknesses, and how do we take care of them?
Well, he's an ordinary man, right?
Yeah.
If Big Amachi is a saint, then he is an
Yeah.
ordinary man. That means
Yeah.
that he will have struggles, he will have issues, and maybe there is forgiveness at the end.
Yeah.
A number of people, and we're drawing near to the end here. Pardon me, a number of people have asked if you felt the novel was too long, whether it could have been condensed, whether there were too many characters. What are your thoughts, Daniel?
Yes, I thought it was too long. I liked it. I loved reading it, but I thought that some parts of it felt like you were being dragged through it a little bit, and especially in the middle. That being said, it's a journey I would take again and again because it was an awesome journey. Yeah, no, I'll let others chime in and see how they feel.
Preetha?
I was curious the whole, I mean, I held my attention, but I guess for me, the question was, why would someone choose to tell such a complex story over such a long period instead of telling the story through, one character? For example, perhaps it could have just ended with Big Amachi's life, and we get this sort of trajectory, and we see that there's this granddaughter, but he could have made multiple choices. So why did he choose to write such a long story, or a complex and multi-character, multi-dimensional story? And I don't have any answers to that, of course, but I think that one of the things that struck me is that all of the characters touch upon they're sort of character types in certain ways, and they also in other ways break out of them. So I saw the novel kind of in the tradition of Dickens, a classic European realist novel in certain ways. So, like there are characters that are they seem completely type, that as types. Baby Mole perhaps is one of those, and Samuel. There, some of them have names, but they take on Uplift Master. He has, sort of named by his character traits. Even Big Amachi, who doesn't really have a name till the end, and she, all we know about her desires are that they are shaped by her faith and her solidity in her roles as a wife and a mother and a matriarch. So, that is a character type. So that's kind of how I understood the length of this novel, that he was attempting a story of this sort of scope, a realist scope with, where the world must be sort of built from these different perspectives and through these different characters.
And finally to you, Maaza.
I did think that the book was too long. I like Daniel, I felt there were some redundancies in there. That said, that was an immersive experience. And that was the beauty of it. The length contributed to that. When I closed the book, I felt genuinely sad that I had to let these characters go, and that's, I think, a credit to the language in here and these moments of suspense that kept moving throughout the book.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I have to confess, I loved it so much. I read it twice. It was just gorgeous. And I want to thank you all for being part of this wonderful discussion. Maaza Mengiste, Daniel Marchalik, and Preetha Mani, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
And in about 15 minutes, I'll be interviewing Abraham Verghese about his own family story that inspired the novel and how he balances being a physician and author. You can still register for that at the link in the chat. The next book club meeting will be Wednesday, September 27th. The book is Trust by Hernan Diaz, which shared this year's Pulitzer Prize in fiction. So keep an eye on your inbox for more information. And finally, before you go, please take a minute to fill out a short survey about this event. It will pop up on your screen. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Yan and Zhang is our events manager. Allie Dickman is our events director. And we couldn't do it without the support of Leslie Van Sant, Kennedy Wright, Carly Cloud, Lauren Centrella, Rendra Silva, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thanks to all of them and to you as well. I'm Diane Rehm. I hope to see you next month. Bye-bye now.